memory is often one of those it's sort of the bedrock upon which we build our narratives of democracy, our narratives of social inclusion, right? Who belongs, why they belong, who doesn't belong, and why they don't belong. And so when we look at democratic systems, often you don't really hear a lot of politicians or public figures saying things like, here's the mechanisms of democracy and this is why they're important. Instead, you hear, this is the history of our republic. This is the history of the Western world, or the history of the democratic world. And if you want that to continue, you have to get involved. You have to, right? Or if you say, okay, well, who do we include into this notion of democracy? Who gets to belong? Well, we have all kinds of narratives, these stories that we tell about immigrant populations that have come over and built the country, right? It's all rooted in memory. It's rooted in these deeply held convictions about how our history informs our sense of self in the present. So when sociologists look at these sorts of issues, depending on the kind of sociologist you're talking about, what we're really interested in is the sharing of sign, symbol, and meaning, right? So we look at how social narratives are built through collective symbols, collective, shared memories of sort of cultural memories of events or objects, right? So when we think of, for example, the United Nations, right, sort of the quintessential international democratic institution, right? So much of its history is bound up in the shared narrative of the Holocaust, right? And so the symbolism of the Holocaust, of the death camps, of the imagery, of the swastika and the Nazis, that all of those images are how we convey our shock and disgust and horror at this historical event. And that tells us as a people what we should be doing, right? So Raphael Lemkin, the guy that basically created this notion of genocide, this is how he did it. He shared this with people. He said, look, the Holocaust is more than just the annihilation of Jewish people in Europe, right? It's a symbol of everything that is a fundamental breakdown of social order, a fundamental breakdown of democracy, an abrogation of rights, and the annihilation of not just life, but the very notion that the victims of the Holocaust were even human. All of that is tied into social meaning, how we share, how we try to relate the events of the world to one another. And all of that is bound into history. It's all bound into memory. So today, when we look at, when we talk about genocide, or we talk about genocide in the context of Canada's Indigenous peoples, right? We can't help but draw on the symbolism and the values, the meanings that emerged out of our understanding of the Holocaust, right? So our memory of that genocide informs how we talk about genocides in Canada. There's a concept that we can sort of talk about in the context of right-wing narratives of things like democracy in our own history. It's called counter-memory. And counter-memory is this sort of this alternative universe, right? This alternative sort of collective belief or memory about historical events, that two groups of people can be examining the same event or the same series of events and come to fundamentally different conclusions, right? They'll construct narratives around them in different ways. They'll memorialize them in different ways. So when we look at, for example, the institution of slavery in the United States, white America remembers slavery and its end, particularly the Civil War, in one very in a particular way, and that memorialization gives rise to things like Confederate soldier monuments that go up in the 1960s, right? But Black Americans have a different memory, counter memory, that is buried within sort of the cultural history of Black Americans that keeps alive their stories, their experiences of slavery. In a very, very weird way, right-wing movements today, especially ones in North America and Europe, have inverted that relationship. they look at events like, say, the end of World War II. They see that as the beginning of the end of sort of white dominance in Europe, right? They see the emergence of the United Nations, literally an institution designed to give voice to industrializing nations, not just non-white nations in the global south, but all nations. And they interpret that as an assault led largely by Jewish forces against the white social order. They effectively recreate the world. And the way that they do it is they invert the signs and symbols, right? So instead of looking at the history of Europe, the history of North America, and saying, okay, white folk have been in charge since contact, right? So for like 500 years in North America and longer in Europe. These right-wing movements especially reinterpret that history to say, yeah, it only seems that way. The truth is that Jewish folks or international bankers, which is always just a stand-in for Jewish folk, they've always been in charge and they've always been persecuting us. The truth is we don't even run our own countries anymore. So that inversion of counter-memory, that creation of this new alternative counter-memory, actually provides them with the kind of epistemological, historical, and even emotional foundation to conduct activism in the present, because they're no longer seeking to repress people and maintain the status quo. In their own minds, they're seeking to defend themselves from annihilation. And that's a very powerful motivator for a lot of folks. So they actually create this new kind of counter-memory to reinterpret social history. We can find examples in the international sphere of spaces where groups of people, both perpetrators and victims of violence, have come together in a space that allows for dialogue, right? The most obvious example is going to be the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Rwanda, post-genocide, right? There were simply too many genocidaires to try them all, right? You'd be trying 50% of every village in Rwanda. So instead, they create spaces where dialogue can occur and where, in lieu of sort of punishment through the legal system, you have social sanction, you have confession, forgiveness, and resolution or restitution. That certainly allowed Rwanda to transform itself after the genocide, right? In ways that are still fascinating. I think we can do something similar in North America, but part of the challenge in this case is that some of the folks that we would be considering inviting in, I'm thinking primarily of anti-government extremists, far-right extremists, neo-Nazis, literal fascists, they're waiting for a way in, because once they're in, they get to use the tools of the system to annihilate it. And once that happens, they're not interested in dialogue. They're interested in the systematic dismantling of the very thing that gave them power in the first place, the power to dismantle itself, right? It's a very, very risky proposition. Actually have to go back to the Holocaust. There are very few people today with a living memory of the Holocaust, right? Most of our survivors are gone, right? Most of the veterans who fought in those wars are gone. When they were alive, there was always a living memory, right? There was always those knowledge keepers that were there that could say to us, this wasn't an abstract, this wasn't a controversial claim. It happened. We were there. Here's my tattoo, right? But we don't have that anymore. And so the 20th century, especially the first half of the 20th century, is now something of a cipher for anyone who wants to inject their own ideology, right? They could say, okay, well, maybe the Holocaust wasn't quite as bad, or maybe the Nazis, maybe they had some ideas that we could talk about, right? They made the trains run on time. They didn't. But because there's no living memory, there's that cultural memory is now effectively an artifact of textbooks, it's easier to reinterpret history, right? To construct new historical narratives. And when you can do that, you can begin to build these stories, these imaginaries of times that were better, that were healthier and cleaner and easier. And then you can say, follow me, and we'll take you back there. At the heart of the Make America Great Again movement, MAGA and Trumpism, at the heart of it is a fascist worldview, but wallpapered over top of that is this memory, this imagined space of the 1950s when everything was better. For who? White men. The people primarily responsible for voting Trump into power, right? So the farther back you go in time, the easier it becomes for you to basically say whatever you want about that time. There's no one that can stop you. And you can strip away all the parts you don't want to talk about to produce a new kind of cultural imaginary that motivates you in the present.